I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on information confrontation and China's discourse strategy with Dr. Chris Ford. Before introducing Chris, let me just say a few words to help set the context. As many of you know, we do about 8 to 10 workshops per year here at CGSR on a variety of topics. And in recent years, we've found ourselves with increasing frequency, almost regardless of the topic, coming to a discussion of the ways in which Russia and China, and to a more limited extent, North Korea, are trying to shape the information context within which the U.S. makes decisions about its commitments and defense strategy. And so last winter, we convened a workshop focused on that question, information confrontation strategies of Russia and China and the needed U.S. response. One of the highlights of that workshop was a presentation that our speaker today gave, which focused on the U.S. response to in particular, the information confrontation strategy of China. And it was sufficiently compelling that we invited Chris to turn it into a manuscript that we published as a Livermore paper, and which I commend to you, and which was listed in the invitation to the event. Today, Chris will summarize and expand upon the arguments in that paper. He will help us to understand how the Chinese Communist Party's approach to information competition with the West fits into and derives from the party's broader approach to political control, both in China and increasingly abroad. Dr. Ford is a non-resident senior fellow at CGSR, I'm happy to say. He's also a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and he's a visiting professor in Missouri State University's Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, which, if you don't know that program, it's actually, although it's Missouri State, it's located in Fairfax, Virginia. He served previously as a MITRE Fellow at the MITRE Corporation, where he was also the founding director of the Center for Strategic Competition. From January 2018 to January 2021, following his unanimous confirmation by the U.S. Senate, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. And for a period of time, he also exercised the authorities of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. At State, that Chris helped lead the department's reorientation to support U.S. competitive strategy vis-a-vis China and Russia, with a particular focus on technology denial and national security export controls. Chris is going to make introductory remarks of approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll proceed to a Q&A session. Please raise your hand electronically in order to join that conversation. Or if you prefer, go ahead and send me a message in the chat function. Make sure it comes my way. And I'll do my best to see that it gets into play in the time available. Chris, thanks so much for making the time to do this with us today. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Brad. It's a huge pleasure. It's great to be back here at the Livermore Lab and to see so many folks joining us on this circuit this morning. It was indeed a huge pleasure. I mean, I really enjoyed being able to be part of that, the workshop you mentioned a moment ago, Brad, and to be able to publish a manuscript with as part of your occasional paper series. What I thought I would do today is recap that just briefly, but since I don't want to just be repeating myself, and sort of build upon that foundation to talk a little bit further, more specifically about Chinese approaches to information confrontation and how that, as you say, how that fits into sort of grand strategy. The obligatory caveat, of course, these are just my own personal views. They don't necessarily reflect those of anybody else, although I hope they reflect lots of people's views, but certainly in no official sense whatsoever. So by way of just sort of setting the scene, the paper that you referred to, which your staff very helpfully provided to me here in case I'd forgotten it, I argued that China and Russia take somewhat different approaches to information confrontation with us and with the rest of the world. I described China as having what termed trying to advance a replacement narrative, if you will, and I'll explain that in a second, while Russia takes something along more the lines of a wreckers narrative, if you will. Now, what I mean by that is sort of as follows. For its part, China is very focused upon trying to tell a consistent narrative about China, about the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and it basically wants the rest of the world to believe that story. So, in a sense, strategically, it's trying to as I see it, it's trying to restructure the current international system into one that is that has a much more sort of Sino-centric form. This is something that Xi Jinping has called a new type of great power relations, but we should understand it very clearly to be acceptance of China's replacement narrative for the received wisdoms of the international system, with a new one that is essentially one that revolves around China and this idea of sort of a harmonious and to some degree vertically constituted system of order, at the epicenter of which is China, of course, as the kind of civilizational and political and moral leader and the norm setter for that system. But because that's the focus of Chinese propaganda and discourse warfare, I think there's a difference in how it is that China and Russia approach the question of truth in their discourses. For a replacement narrative to succeed, there still needs to be some basic idea of truth. I mean, even if for no other reason that we are being asked to accept China's version of the truth as actually being true. And that gives it a distinctive structural difference, at least in my argument, from how the Russians approach things in their propaganda, because the Russian approach to, well, at least to outward-facing propaganda, is really much less interested in replacing existing understandings with a replacement narrative. It doesn't really need a concept of truth because it's not trying to do that. Rather, it just seeks to undermine, in effect, everyone else's faith in the possibility of any such truth. And this is, of course, why Russian propaganda narratives are so perfectly comfortable with advancing mutually, sometimes mutually contradictory storylines at the same time. And people have used different phrases to describe this. I quote one source that describes this as sort of a fire hose of falsehood. The Russia scholar Mark Galeotti describes this in a recent book. I think he uses a Russian term, infoshum, which, if you believe him, is something sort of like information noise. But the point here is that it's not about replacing what we think to be the case about the international system with a Russian version. It's just about destabilizing everyone else's narratives and dividing them against each other, apparently on the theory that the collapse of the West's willingness to defend its own values in the world will leave the Putin regime some sort of strategic space in which to consolidate its kleptocracy and have its way with sort of this curtain of brutalized subject states around the perimeter that the Soviets used to call the near abroad. So if you're doing that, you don't care whether everyone actually has a replacement narrative that crystallizes. You just want to break down what's currently there. Now, I would argue, and did in the paper, that of these two approaches, in some respects, the Chinese replacement narrative of Sino-centric order is sort of conceptually perhaps the easiest or the easier of the two to counteract, in the sense that in order to work well, a replacement narrative needs to sort of hang together in some kind of a coherent way. Otherwise, it just sounds like gobbledygook, right? So confronted with someone who's trying to sort of advance a replacement narrative through propaganda and disinformation, the objective then is to sort of poke holes in its logic and to point out its inconsistencies or its hypocrisies, or frankly, in the Chinese case, just to expose that replacement narrative for the imperialist project. Let's not mince words here, that it actually is. It's a little more challenging to fight the fire hose of destabilizing disinformation that Russia is more fond of putting out in the world. But I would argue that there are at least three things we should probably be doing to make ourselves more resistant to those kinds of disinformation problems. Now, the first is to do more to sensitize ourselves simply to the fact that we are being targeted for disinformation and the basic nature of each adversary's effort. To take the analogy to, I don't know, say public relations or whatever, advertising perhaps, you may not, as an individual consumer, be able to, fact check the specific impressive sounding claims that a company might be making about some commercial product that it's trying to sell you. Lots of things might be said in that respect. And so even if you can't fact check them, though, it's incredibly important to know that they are trying to sell you something, right? Even that little glimmer of awareness can help make one a little bit more resistant to being spun. And I will come back to that idea in a moment when I talk about the details of how it is that China seeks to advance its discourse strategy in the world. But I do think this is critical. It is really, really valuable, even just to be aware that someone is trying to spin you, because the most dangerous spin, of course, is that sort that that most dangerous sort of manipulation occurs when you aren't entirely aware that you are being spun or manipulated. And at least if you are aware that that's the game, you can be perhaps a little cleverer about listening. So that's the first thing. The second piece is perhaps harder and slower, and that is, I think we do need to, and this is not a surprise, we do need to do more to help people become better consumers of information, more skilled at, more accustomed to, and frankly, more willing to put the mental effort into being thoughtful listeners to information and to narratives about the world. Now, that doesn't mean being just reflexively skeptical and doubting everything, because that actually plays into Russia's hands in this context. But it does mean being better at thinking about how to trust and when to trust, being mindful of factual grounding and credibility of sources and logical consistency and all those sorts of things that really ought to be kind of elemental, but too often these days are not. To be aware of the potential impact of cognitive biases upon your own understandings and upon others' understandings, and maybe ideally a bit more statistically literate, perhaps. But also, and I do think this is also really important, I'm also more cautious about forming those kinds of first impressions on a new topic that can so powerfully shape how we interpret subsequent information. That kind of anchoring effect is really, really powerful. And if you can be even a little bit more cautious at the outset, you can, I think, make yourself a harder target, if you will, for disinformation going forward. None of those things are particularly easy to do or quick to change. But I do think we can make ourselves harder targets in very useful ways, whether the disinformation is coming from abroad or from sources closer to home. So those are the first two things. And the third that I argued in the paper is that I think one of our biggest vulnerabilities to disinformation comes in part from the fact that over the last couple of generations we've lost so much confidence in ourselves. Disinformation purveyors like the Russian propaganda apparatus, for example, they're not nearly as good at creating divisions as they are simply of exploiting them once they exist. And the more opportunities we give them to exploit such divisions, the easier their job is going to be. So we make it much easier for disinformation to gain traction when we no longer have a lot of confidence in ourselves and our role in the world, or when we already halfway believe things such as how it's our fellow citizens who are the greatest threat to all we hold dear, greater threat even than foreign tyrants who wish us ill and who direct their disinformation in our direction. So to help us fight through those problems, I do think we need to work through some of those political pathologies that we've come across in recent years and remember and rediscover both that it matters a lot who prevails in today's geopolitical competitions, first of all, and B, why it is that it matters so much. And those are things that we've sometimes, I think, lost sight of. And to the degree that we have, shame on us. But I do think if we can recover that sense of self, we will be much more resistant to disinformation. So that's the recap of the piece that I was very pleased to be able and honored to be able to publish with CGSR earlier this year. But let me now turn to a few questions about how we can better understand the nature of the specifically Chinese challenge in information discourse. Because I do think the CCP has a very distinctive approach to this, again, of which we need to be aware in the same way that you need to be aware that someone who's telling you that this medicine causes all kinds of things or cures all kinds of things, if you're watching a TV advert, for instance, you need to be aware that it is a TV advert, and it may or may not be correct what they're saying, but you're a much better listener if you are aware that the purpose of this is to sell stuff. So one of the most interesting things, to me at least, about the CCP's approach to discourse warfare, as they call it in some circles, is that it goes far beyond just putting that replacement narrative out there. It's not just about advancing a preferred narrative over a dispreferred narrative, because to supercharge the impact of its narratives, China also uses very carefully the web of dependencies that it cultivates with the rest of the world. And it uses this to reward compliance with its vision of sort of a harmonious, Sinocentric order. And it uses these dependencies also to punish departures from that supposed harmony. So it's not just about putting the narrative out there, it's about, in effect, creating a massive program to sort of train and incentivize us to validate that narrative, if you will. So you see this, in a bunch of ways, but in the ways that the PRC has employed economic pressures to export, to some degree, measures of its own domestic censorship overseas. Even against foreign citizens and companies abroad who are increasingly penalized for saying things that the CCP doesn't want people to say or that they find disagreeable. Even entire countries can face this kind of collective chastisement, as the Australians and Lithuanians have both found out relatively recently. So that's part of it. And it's not just that they use those dependencies, it's that there is a strategic effort underway to expand as much as possible that web of sort of generalized asymmetries in the world, that dependency upon China in various respects that is then, of course, weaponized to these kinds of ends. And you can see this to some extent, in comments Xi Jinping has made. In 2014, he talked about the importance of using the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, to build ever greater connectivity, in his phrase, with the rest of the world. And this connectivity, he said, involves every front. It is multidimensional and it forms a network. And that's certainly true, I would say. It does indeed, BRI and efforts, other pieces of China's overseas engagement do revolve around maximizing the number of asymmetric bilateral ties that exist between China and other countries. Scholars like Elizabeth Economy have pointed out the degree to which China very much prefers its foreign relations to be done on a kind of a one-on-one bilateral basis, usually with partners who are smaller and weaker, and that they disprefer working with other countries in groups. Because that ensures that the results of those relationships are as lopsided as possible. There's big China dealing with countries that are in many ways smaller, in most cases smaller and weaker. And that does create, and Xi Jinping's not wrong, it does create a network of sorts. But significantly, it's a network of it's interconnected and interdependent, but in profoundly unequal ways, in ways that favor China. Participants in the system are more dependent upon China than China is upon them, and this gives them strong incentives not to anger or displease the CCP authorities, and it gives Beijing pretty powerful instruments of influence and of control. And you can see this fairly explicitly in what Xi Jinping has called the dual circulation policy that China is now, or says it's now pursuing. Now, this is a policy under which the CCP regime in China makes itself as little dependent as possible upon the outside world, for sources of productive demand, for example, more driven by internal consumer demand rather than export-driven growth, for example. So, to make itself as little dependent upon the outside world and therefore as resistant as possible to any pressures from the outside world, while still maximizing the extent to which the rest of the world depends upon China. The 14th five-year plan, which is still their operative guidance document, talks about how this will, and I'll quote you here, accelerate the cultivation of new advantages for China. And it says that these advantages China will be able to use them in both international cooperation and competition. So there's an explicitly competitive strategy here that revolves around creating and impliedly using those sorts of dependencies. Now let's put this, if you'll forgive a little historical excursion, let's put this in historical context a little bit. It is, of course, not a new thing for Chinese officials, or really anyone in world history, to take advantage of economic dependencies for political purposes. And this is true in some ways. It goes back for a long time, even in China with respect to dealings with the West. If you in the late 19th and the late 18th and early 19th centuries, for instance, the Qing dynasty, the dynasty that was then ruled China, despite its growing decrepitude, actually enjoyed a great deal of leverage over the British East India Company at the time, by virtue of the fact that those company profits from its monopoly in the British system of British tea trade with China, those profits made up a significant portion of the entire British Empire's overall revenue. And that gave Chinese officials a lot of leverage vis-a-vis the East India Company, which was certainly, as we know from elsewhere in history, and such as in India and South Asia, it was hardly the EIC was hardly shy about pushing locals around, but it was very deferential for a very long time with China because of that dependence upon profits, and this financial dependence made it politically docile in many ways for many years. They're quite explicitly afraid to offend Chinese officials who controlled access to that profitable trade. There's a quote I found from company agents in Canton who once wrote back to London in the early 1800s, it's at one point, saying that their only and invariable rule of conduct to be observed in China was, quote, on no occasion to give offense to the Chinese government. And there's actually a dispute in 1808 between the Qing dynasty and the Brits, in which a muscular Royal Navy flotilla actually backed down and gave the Qing what it demanded, worrying, as the rear admiral who was in charge of it put it at the time, worrying about the hold they have upon us by means of our trade, and explicitly afraid that if the British offended China, it, quote, would exclude the English forever from the most advantageous monopoly it possesses in the universe. Right. So now that deference to China for economic reasons did fade by the 1830s. And of course, in 1839, you have the Opium War and the beginning of what Chinese now look back on in some respects and call their century of humiliation. But for a long time, that was a pretty powerful economic tool that China used pretty successfully to keep the barbarians in line. So you shouldn't forget that there is a backstory here. And China, of course, has rather famously had success in analogous ways in more recent generations. And persuading a whole bunch of Western governments, including our own, to adopt much more favorable policy positions vis-a-vis Beijing by sort of dangling the lure of the Chinese market, or perhaps dangling the possibility of being cut off from the Chinese market in front of business leaders who have influence with their capitals. There's a Chinese foreign ministry official in the early 90s who is quoted as having said, "The Chinese market is a big cake. Come early and you get a big piece. I hope our countries have good relations, but it takes two to tango." And of course, the implication there is very clear, and leaders to this day in China, including Xi Jinping himself, promise that China will continue to share its market opportunities, as he has put it, with the rest of the world, while of course also reminding folks that that munificence is kind of, well, conditional, right? If you say or do the wrong thing, it can be cut off. So there's a long history of using economic leverage in one form or another. But what I think is interesting and really distinctive about modern CCP approaches to doing this is actually not the fact of using leverage for those purposes, but the degree to which it has become a remarkably deeply sort of systematic approach. And I think it's grounded in fairly clear theory of social control, which I'd like to talk about a little bit. This is a model of social control that's been pioneered at home in China, where of course it exists in its most grotesque and repressive forms, but it's also one that they are, in my own personal view, increasingly trying to export. So what do I mean by the system of social control? So rather than trying to achieve the quixotic feat of directly controlling the details of individual behavior across a large and complex society, and of course modern China is an extraordinarily large and complex society, rather than trying to do that directly, the CCP aims to exert what you might call sort of effective control over a large and diverse society through indirect means. It aspires, in effect, to influence large masses of people into desired patterns of behavior in the aggregate by relying as much as possible upon those people's autonomous choices within an incentive structure that it seeks to create, rather than having to give them all, God forbid, detailed behavioral directions, right? That's just not available as an option. But this approach uses, I would say, it has three structural elements. The first is that it requires widespread monitoring and data collection about the dynamics of and behavior in the targeted audiences, whether that's at home or abroad. So it requires, it's heavily data driven. It requires the deliberate cultivation of a web. This is number two. Deliberate cultivation of a web of asymmetric dependencies. That can be economic, they can be technological or whatever. And then it requires the weaponization of this, I call it a leverage web, the weaponization of this leverage web as an instrument both of reward and of punishment with which to train others into habits of conformity with the party's ways of thinking about the world and about China's role in that world. And so the aim is to shape actors' incentives by rewarding desirable behaviors and punishing deviant ones, and to have a system of surveillance that's pervasive enough that it gives Chinese authorities a reasonable likelihood of being able to tell who is conforming. and who is not, so that rewards or punishments can be doled out appropriately. This is very Jeremy Bentham panopticon-ish, if you catch the reference. But this is an incentive-based system of trained conformity that doesn't really attempt to deny or substitute specific state commands for individual human agency, but rather to co-opt that agency. And in some ways, if this works, it can be, in theory, a very efficient way to control. Now, the epitome of this, as you will all know, of course, is inside China, is this sort of the emerging idea of a social credit system, a social credit score concept, whereby, at least in theory, Chinese citizens' behavior is pervasively monitored and recorded enough that people's everyday socioeconomic privileges and opportunities can be adjusted sort of on an ongoing basis, depending upon how closely they conform to the CCP's expectations across a wide range of kind of political and social behaviors. If you engage in anything that the CCP thinks is sort of disharmoniously antisocial, if you will, you might start to have problems getting your high-speed internet connections to work as well as they ought to. You might have trouble obtaining a loan or getting permission to travel, or even accessing social services or public transportation. That's the theory of this system, and it's not fully built, but it is an emerging, certainly an aspiration, and a lot of work is being put into this. And it's probably most advanced in places like Xinjiang with regard to sort of keeping a heavy hand on the Muslim Uyghur population. But the point isn't here to administer punishment to any of the offenders who might cross those lines per se. The real point is to train everyone else, is to train disharmonious citizens into habits of harmoniousness in order to act sort of habitually and systematically as the authorities wish them to act. So it's very well understood that China tries to use these concepts to run, or the CCP tries to use these concepts to run China. What is less appreciated, I think, is the degree to which these totalitarian control mechanisms are explicitly based upon complex systems theory. And you guys at the lab will love this, I'm sure. This point is drawn out pretty effectively, I think, but there's a book on this by a couple of Wall Street Journal reporters, Josh Chin and Liza Lin, as well as some work by a political scientist by the name of Samantha Hoffman, who I think may be British. In any event, what they have outlined how Chinese theories of social control depend quite explicitly and have their origins in Chinese efforts to study Western literature from a generation or two ago on cybernetic theory, and to use this to help build a sort of data-driven approach to social management in China that attempts to apply sort of this mix of carrots and sticks in what Hoffman has termed a strategy of co-optation and coercion. And I think to some extent, although its highest development is, of course, in China, or lowest, morally speaking, but this ugly domestic system is also, to some degree, by degrees and to some extent, being exported by the CCP to the rest of the world. Every time a Western company or a Western celebrity, right, you've seen these clips on YouTube or something, right, faces economic or commercial chastisement and is told to make a kind of groveling apology for having hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, that old saw, right, by saying something that the CCP dislikes. Every time that happens, the CCP is trying to establish and to reinforce habits of conformity all around the world. Every time a Western scholar is blacklisted and barred from doing work in China for inconvenient facts identified by his or her research and scholarship, the CCP is trying to train other scholars to be less impertinent. Every time a Western film studio faces exclusion from the Chinese market, if China or the CCP is portrayed less than favorably in a screenplay, every time that happens, the party is laying down a marker about how we must all describe China in the future. And every time a country, I mentioned Australia or Lithuania, every time a country faces PRC economic warfare for rejecting Beijing's political demands, every time it's pressured by China to change how it does something like teaching history to its school children, or it's punished for showing some degree of solicitude to Taiwan. Every time that happens, the CCP is trying to establish and to reinforce global docility. Now, these are external manifestations of that system of control, and they're, of course, much different in degree than the sort of really intensive totalizing measures which the CCP tries to implement in China itself. And particularly, as I mentioned, against the Uyghurs in that sort of dystopian high-tech prison province of Xinjiang. But these kinds of outward-facing efforts are not really much different in kind. They're only different in degree. And Beijing is doing what it can to expand their reach. So yes, it is true that the PRC is hardly the first country to weaponize networks of interdependence. To some extent, we do it ourselves in the United States, and we have for the last couple of decades quite effectively used the world's dependence upon the kind of hub and spoke international financial network of global banking that tends still to run through the United States. To give teeth to our economic sanctions, go talk to OFAC and learn about the fantastic ways in which they've been able to take advantage of that dependency of the rest of the world. But I do think that the details matter, right? And the U.S. uses that kind of weaponization of interdependence in very different ways and for very different reasons than China uses its weaponized interdependences. We spend our time trying to do things like preventing foreign companies from helping a belligerent theocracy in Iran develop nuclear weapons. We use that weaponized interdependence, to use the academic phrase, to enforce sanctions against North Korea that the UN has put on that country. We use it to combat drug smuggling or human trafficking, or punish serious human rights abuses. In other words, we use that weaponization of interdependence for what I would contend unapologetically are generally pretty important and even noble purposes, things that it would be sort of weirdly discreditable to oppose actually doing. And we do it focusing upon generally concrete issues of behaviors, and don't invade and annex your neighbors, right? And so we use that as a tool, but that's a very different game than the Chinese are playing, in the sense that the CCP weaponizes global dependencies upon China as best it can to specifically influence changes in speech and thought abroad. It uses those dependencies to support its worldwide disinformation and propaganda campaigns, and in the service of prolonging the CCP's grip on power in China, but also of giving it more ability to dictate the terms of political discourse to the rest of humanity. It is not focused on big concrete things like, oh my goodness, you shouldn't proliferate nuclear weapons. It's focused on things like how you think and act and speak about China, even amongst yourselves in foreign political communities abroad. And that's a very different thing. And the CCP is very clearly trying to use that global leverage web to inculcate habits of harmonious agreement with the party's preferences, even in matters of speech and expression. It's trying to train us into a sort of reflexive concurrence with that replacement narrative that I described before, that narrative of sinocentric harmony, and with that narrative's presupposition that the only way to domestic or international peace and stability is for everyone to agree with or to defer to the Chinese Communist Party on things of importance. And weirdly, if you know how to read them, they don't do too much to hide this, at least if you're paying attention. You might recall that in the late 2000s, under Hu Jintao, CCP officials began referring to the idea of building a harmonious world. Now, the idea of a harmonious world, as it appeared in Chinese writings at the time, was unmistakably built upon claims that China was, in fact, domestically building a harmonious society under the CCP's leadership. Thereby, of course, by talking about a harmonious world, signaling a desire to export CCP conceptions of that kind of harmonious order into the international arena. And it's pretty well understood what that means. I mean, if you talk to Chinese dissidents, if you're lucky enough to be able to, who have been repressed by the CCP party state, they for years, sometimes fairly wryly, referred to themselves as having been harmonized. And political docility and conformity is unmistakably at the core of the regime supporting stability that the CCP seeks to ensure in China itself and increasingly to export abroad. And harmonization is rather an explicit objective, even today, of Beijing's global foreign policy. As recently as October 2021, Xi Jinping himself talked about how civilizations can achieve harmony only through communication and can make progress only through harmonization. Humanity should overcome difficulties in solidarity and pursue common development in harmony. Now, that kind of talk of harmony may sound fairly innocuous if you're just reading an English translation in the isolation without awareness of the overtones of such terminology in the Chinese context. But the careful reader should make no mistake about it. We are all being told what is to be expected of us. So I'm circling back to my idea of awareness, right? It may be that becoming more careful and resilient consumers of information per se is not the only thing that we need to do in order to armor ourselves against Chinese disinformation and against the CCP's effort to train us into harmonious acceptance of a new, more or less Sino-centric international replacement narrative. We also need to be much more thoughtful about the full range of our engagement with the PRC and more mindful of its propensity to use economic and technological and other entanglements as tools with which to increase what CCP officials describe as China's discourse power. Now, this doesn't mean, it absolutely does not mean shunning all engagement with China, any more than being more resistant to Russian propaganda means going cold turkey on all social media. But engagement with China does require more care, more perspicacity, more cautiousness than we have become accustomed to applying to such matters during the last few decades. So again, back to awareness. Most of us know enough as consumers living in a modern society to keep, one hand on our figurative wallet, as it were, when talking with a traveling salesman who's trying to convince us of the virtues of his wares. But so too, I would argue, should people all around the world be much more wary when Chinese diplomats speak, as they of course continually do, about the new type of international relations that they are trying to build and about the win-win solutions, as they will say, that ties to China's development will supposedly provide to everyone, everywhere. Being more resistant and resilient in the face of the sort of manipulative political and policy distortions of that CCP leverage web, that resistance and resilience starts with being aware that this web exists and how and why it's being used. And that's another reason why it's such a pleasure to be able to sort of talk about these issues with you guys today. And I am very much looking forward to our discussion. So I hope I haven't gone too long. And once again, Brad, thank you so much for having me here. And I am looking forward to our chat.